Okay, welcome to our initial 2025 New York Giants Preservation Society meeting for today, January 9th, 2025, with Bryan Soderholm-Difatte. Bryan will be speaking about his book that came out a few years ago, The Golden Era of Major League Baseball, A Time of Transition and Integration. And he's mostly going to be speaking about the New York Giants and their quest to be integrated. Before we get to Bryan, just a few things. This marks our 175th Zoom together. So that's a nice number. Very proud of that. We should all be proud of that. So next week we have the legendary Jerry Eisenberg. Jerry was supposed to be talking in December, but we had to reschedule. Jerry will be speaking about his new book on Larry Doby and mostly about Doby's relationship with Monty Irvin. Prior to Happy New Year, I don't know, according to Larry David, I don't think you're allowed to say Happy New Year after January 7th, but I'm going to break that. Say Happy New Year. Right before the New Year came out, I sent out that newsletter. Hope you enjoy it. I put down a donation thing in there if anybody wants to contribute. Funds aren't exactly wonderful at this point, but we have enough to get by. I have to pay now for the GoDaddy to keep the website up, and we will go from there. But I just wanted to pass that along to you. But why don't we all introduce Bryan Soderholm-Difatte? New York Giants Preservation Society welcomes you. This is Bryan's book. He's going to talk about it. As you can see on the cover, we got Leo DeRocha, Monty Irvin, Willie Mays, and Hank Thompson. Bryan, the floor is yours.
Okay. First of all, can people hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Glad to hear that. I see at least two people who I'm supposing might actually be in San Francisco, Jim and Jim. Are you guys in San Francisco right now? And Mars? Uh, okay. A number of people in San Francisco. For those of us, I'm in DC, who have to deal with the polar vortex issue and the bitch and cold. I'd like to take us back to July 1949, when the temperature in New York City was roughly about mid 70s during the day. And on July 6th,
What?
You can have the last spread.
Whoever is on, please mute yourself. My apologies, Bryan. Go ahead.
okay. So I'd like to begin by talking about a New York Times article that appeared on July 6th, 1949. The headline was Move to Strengthen Lineup, Irvin, Top International League Batter, Thompson, obtained from Jersey. And the article goes on to say, this is in the New York Times, when the Giants take the field against the Phillies tonight in the Polo Grounds, assembled fans will view the unprecedented spectacle of two Negroes in Giant uniforms. And then it quotes Horace Stoneham as saying that Irvin and Thompson might provide the power which will pull the Giants up among the leaders again. That was on July 6th. As it turned out, the game was rained out that day. The next game against Philadelphia, also neither Irvin nor Thompson played. My suspicion for that is perhaps because Leo DeRocha figured breaking those two black players into a game against the Philadelphia Phillies, who had exercised such racial animosity and aggressiveness against Jackie Robinson when he broke into the major leagues, might not have been that good of an idea. The Phillies were still notorious for being fairly antagonistic towards the whole concept of blacks in Major League Baseball. But who are these guys? Monty Irvin was 30 years old and a longtime star in the Negro Leagues dating back to the late 1930s. He and Hank Thompson had both signed contracts with the Giants before the season, were sent to their AAA farm club at Jersey City. And through the first 63 games at Jersey City, Irvin was leading the league with a 373 batting average when the Giants decided to call him up. In fact, he would only play in 19 games that season for the Giants, in which he hit 274 in the games he started, which was only the 19 starts, and in 17 other games where he appeared initially as a pinch hitter, he was 0 for 14 with 4 walks. The other guy was Hank Thompson, and Thompson had somewhat of a roughneck reputation, in the sense that, for one thing, he had been tried for murder, and he was acquitted by a jury of his peers. And he had also failed in an initial major league call-up by the St. Louis Browns in 1947. In fact, I'd like to make the proposition that failed was actually not the correct word. He was arguably, I would say, the first American League player to become a regular, black player to become a regular in the American League. Larry Doby, of course, broke in July of in early July 1947, started his first game the next day, and did not start another game the rest of the year, just coming off the bench. Whereas Hank Thompson, 21 years old in 1947, was immediately thrust into the starting lineup for the St. Louis Browns, along with Willard Brown, who appeared the next day. Willard Brown playing kind of the role that Monty Irvin would play a couple of years later with the Giants, in that he was an experienced veteran star in the Negro Leagues. Neither of them lasted more than a month in the major leagues before the St. Louis Browns concluded that they had not performed up to expectations. Nonetheless, I still think it was a very significant development that you had a team other than the Dodgers and the Indians in 1947 break in 2 black players, and that both of them actually were, in the games they appeared as starting position players. The next day against the Phillies, as I mentioned, neither Hank Thompson nor Monty Irvin was in the game. But the New York Times thought it was important to note in the write-up of that game that prior to the game itself, the pregame practice, which was Leo's first chance to observe them in action, that he called up, that he was quite impressed with what he saw. But he did not have occasion in this game to use either one of them. Which brings us then to July 8th, 1949, Ebbets Field, night game. Don Newcombe pitching for the Dodgers, batting leadoff and playing second base for the New York Giants, Hank Thompson. So Hank Thompson, in his first at bat on a 1-1 count, popped out to third. That was in the first inning, starting off the game. In the third inning, on the first pitch, he flied out to right field. In the fifth inning, with the Giants losing 3-0, he drew a walk on 7 pitches from Newcombe, which was the beginning of a 3-run rally that chased Don Newcombe, tied the game. In the sixth inning, he grounded out to second base off Newcombe's reliever, Rex Barney. And in the eighth inning, with the Giants now losing 4-3, after Monty Irvin made his debut in the major leagues for the New York Giants and walked on 6 pitches, he sacrificed the runners over, but unfortunately the Giants were unable to score a run, and they wound up losing the game 4-3. Now, the standard narrative on integration celebrates Jackie Robinson and the great players that came after him, the likes of Larry Doby, Roy Campanella, Don Newcombe, Monty Irvin, Willie Mays, Ernie Banks, Hank Aaron, Frank Robinson, who proved that there was absolutely no doubt about the ability of Black players to compete at the major league level. Baseball's powers that be could now say that segregation was in the past. But what the standard narrative glosses over is that the 1950s were not an after Jackie Robinson post-racial era for Major League Baseball, where Black players had as much opportunity as whites to compete for starting positions on Major League teams. In fact, with the beginning years of integration, what the pioneers of integration demonstrated was that Black players with superior talent that could not be denied henceforth would find a place in Major League starting lineups. And of the 78 Black players who had appeared on a Major League roster by the time Jackie retired after the 1956 World Series, 29 had been a regular on their team for at least 1 year as a starting position player, a starting pitcher, or a relief ace. But only 7 for as many as 5 years. And if you want to include Willie Mays, that would be 8. But Willie Mays had yet to appear 5 full years in the major leagues because, unfortunately, after his 1951 season, he was a draft pick of the United States Army during the Korean War. So there was very little allowance at the time for Black players who were struggling, unless they were among those elite players, or who suffered injuries, let alone failure to meet expectations to last as a starting position player. 2 others who fell short, for example, were Luke Easter of the Cleveland Indians, first baseman, and Sam Jethro of the Boston Braves, center fielder. Both were older than advertised, and both were derailed, being in their mid-30s, by injury or health problems that basically kind of took them out of the equation as far as their teams were concerned. In Luke Easter's case, it was bad knees and then a broken foot. In Sam Jethro's case, it was general frustration with being the only Black on his team at the time, and visual impairment problems that he was perhaps less than forthcoming because he was perhaps concerned about his job in telling people about. And then you also had Satchel Paige and Willard Brown. Willard Brown, after his short tryout with the St. Louis Browns after being released, never tried to get back in the major leagues again. And Satchel Paige, well, he was another player who was possibly older than advertised, although sometimes I think he was also younger than advertised. In the event, the Cleveland Indians gave him an opportunity. He was released basically within months of Bill Veeck having sold the club in November of 1950. And then he would sign later on with the St. Louis Browns, by then owned by Mr. Veeck. So by the time that Jackie Robinson took off his uniform for the last time in 1956, only 20 of the 78 Blacks who had made it to the big leagues by then could claim to have been a core regular on a major league roster for at least 5 years by the end of the 1950s, by 1960. 20 of those 78. And of those, 11 were elite players. Elite being defined as either by the WAR metric, wins above replacement metric, and I use Baseball Reference for that, for measuring comparative player value for their 5 best years in the 1950s, or on a career arc that landed them in the Hall of Fame. And 10 of the 11 are, in fact, in the Hall of Fame. All of them except Newcomb, who at least twice has been considered by the Veterans Committee. And one thing that's of significance, I think, is that by 1960, if you take from the Jackie Robinson's integration in 1947 through 1960, 5 years after he retired, which would then include Frank Robinson having debuted in 1956, 4 of the top 5 players in wins above replacement value in the National League for their 5 best years were blacks. The 5 top players were Willie Mays, his 5 best years being 1955 to 58, then Stan Musial, the one white, followed by Jackie Robinson from 1948 to 52, Ernie Banks from 55 to 59, Hank Aaron from 56 to 1960, and bringing up the rear at number 10 of the best players over a 5-year period between the time Jackie Robinson broke in and 5 years after he retired is Frank Robinson for his best years, 1956 to 1960. So again, in the beginning, I think of integration, I think that team owners understood that for most players, the great majority of white players would accept a black teammate with superior ability. That's one thing. That's a hurdle that could be overcome because terrific talent ultimately cannot be denied. But in the intensely competitive world and tenuous world of Major League Baseball, having to compete with black players of comparable ability for starting positions, may the best man win, that's something else entirely, a far bigger obstacle to white players' acceptance. It's important to remember that unlike the difference between the great and the good, the variability of performance among most players who are regulars in the major leagues, while often still distinguishable, it's not nearly as obvious. Yet those are the very players who provide ballast to major league teams, without whom the major league business could not survive, because nearly all of them would have to, are necessary to provide stars like Babe Ruth, let's say, or Lou Gehrig, with the ballast they need to be on winning teams and to single themselves out for great players. Nearly all of these players, most players in the major leagues, are doomed ultimately to be forgotten unless they're like Bobby Thompson and even Ralph Branca for the roles they played in iconic moments in baseball history. So again, 15 years after Jackie Robinson made his debut and 5 years after he had retired from the game, it was still not a certainty that black players of far more modest abilities than elite players, like those I named, had any realistic chance of becoming regulars on major league rosters. That's where the importance of Hank Thompson comes in, because Thompson was himself somewhat of a trailblazer. Of the 7 and 8, if you want to include Willie Mays and his 2 years of military service, of the 7 or 8 players who had been black players who had been regulars on the major league roster for at least 5 years by 1956, all of them were elite players, either on their way to the Hall of Fame or, like Don Newcombe, certainly worthy of future consideration for the Hall of Fame, except for one. And that one was Hank Thompson. And again, Hank Thompson's prospects were uncertain at best when he and Irvin together integrated the Giants on July 8th of 1949. Of the 2 of them, Irvin was the star. He was the star of the duo because he had a very impressive Negro League performance. And yet, ironically, it was Hank Thompson who immediately became a regular and not Irvin. Irvin's problem was that the Giants had basically a full outfield, which was at that time why am I getting a brain lock here? Whitey Lockman and Bobby Thompson, and then also Willard Marshall, were the outfielders in 1949, and all of them hit over 300. Johnny Mize was the first baseman until he was released or actually traded to the Yankees at the end of the month of August. So Irvin hardly started any games in his call-up, whereas Hank Thompson became regular from this first day, the first game he played with the Giants. I thought it was interesting the way the New York Times introduced him in the first game that he actually played. They made the note of saying that Bill Rigney, who was playing second base at the time for the Giants, turned up with a sore left thumb. And so the stocky, this is the New York Times quote here, the stocky 23-year-old impressed in the field, including making 9 chances without a bobble in the field. And the subhead had nothing to do with either Irvin or Thompson being black players. Instead, the subhead was Rigney out with sore thumb. Now, of course, his prospects were still uncertain, but DeRocher had a problem at second base. In fact, the Giants had not had a decent second baseman really since Whitey Burgess in 1941. And what happened with Whitey Burgess was that he was then drafted into World War II at the time. During the war, I had a fellow named George Hausman, who played in 1944 and 1945. And then once the war ended, elected to go play in the Mexican leagues. And that obviously didn't turn out very well for almost anybody not named Sal Magley, who took a gander at playing in the Mexican leagues. So that cost him 2 major league seasons. Then he was suspended for a year. When he came back early in the 1949 season, he hit 128 in the 15 games he appeared in. Bill Rigney, he had been playing various infield positions since the end of the war. His average WAR, wins above replacement, during those years from 1947 to 1949 was 2.4 wins above average, about the bottom level for starting regular in the major leagues. He had been the regular second baseman for the Giants in 1948, and he had started 22 games at second base before yielding to Hank Thompson. This, for Rigney, did not turn out to be a Wally Pipp type of story, although he never did replace Thompson back at second base. He did wind up playing a lot of shortstop after Buddy Kerr, the shortstop, was injured. Rocher had also tried Jack Lorkey and Davey Williams at second base, neither of whom worked out. Thompson had a pretty good, decent year as a second baseman. But at the end of the year, the Giants traded for an even better second baseman. In fact, they traded for a whole new middle infield, getting Eddie Stanky and Alvin Dark, the shortstop, from the Boston Braves. So that left open, and among the players traded to get them were third baseman Sid Gordon from the Giants, Buddy Kerr himself, and also outfielder Willard Marshall. Thompson was moved by DeRocher over to third base to replace Sid Gordon. And again, it's not as though the Giants didn't have other possible players who could play third base, white players, if they had wanted to do so. There was Bill Rigney, that was another position he could play. And in the minor leagues, they had an upcoming prospect, about 21 years old at the time, named Billy Gardner, who would make his debut with the Giants much later in 1954. Hank Thompson became the regular third baseman. Interestingly enough, even though Willard Marshall, I should say, was part of that trade to the Braves, presumably opening up an outfield position for Monty Irvin, he began the year in the platoon with Don Muller in the outfield. So it was Whitey Lockman, Bobby Thompson, and the platoon of Irvin and Muller in the outfield, until it turned out that Tukey Gilbert, who was playing first base as a replacement for a rookie, a replacement for Johnny Mize, who is now with the Yankees, wasn't meeting quite the expectations that the Giants expected from him. Monty Irvin finished the season in 1950 at first base. And what's interesting about that is that after he became the everyday first baseman for Leo DeRocher on July 28th in 1950, when the Giants were in fifth place, 10 games behind the Dodgers in the pennant race that would be won by the Phillies, by the way. Actually, they were 10 games behind the Phillies, and the Phillies would win. From that moment on, Irvin hit 347 with 10 home runs and 40 RBIs, and the Giants were 43 and 22 thereafter. That was the best record in the National League from that point in the end of July to the end of the season. Still not enough to be able to overcome either the Phillies or the Dodgers for first place, but it certainly did set them up for their pennant run in 1951. But again, the key point with regard to Thompson was that precisely because he was not an exceptional player, the likes of, say, Monty Irvin, the Giants almost certainly could have settled on a white player, Bill Rigney, Billy Gardner, some of the others I mentioned, Davey Williams, some of the others I mentioned, of equal or even less talent than Thompson to play second base in 1949 or third base thereafter, had they been so inclined. But instead of demanding that a black player had to be clearly superior to be a regular, the Giants were at the forefront, and I believe this is very important. They were at the forefront of allowing a black player with, let us just say, average major league skills, certainly capable of playing in the major leagues, to earn a starting position and not be dismissed because of early struggles or injury. And that injury part is important because on July 18th, 1951, playing third base for the New York Giants all season long, Thompson hit a grounder to first base. Pitcher had to cover first base. It was a bang-bang play at first base in the eighth inning. This was against the Cubs, and he was spiked by the pitcher covering first base. That put Hank Thompson out for the remainder of the season, at least as a starting position player for the New York Giants, and certainly at third base. He did not start another game during the regular season. He did start again in the World Series, but we'll get to that in a moment. At the time, Thompson wasn't having the best of years. He was only hitting 239. And what's interesting about that is that two things happened right after that injury, one of which was a direct consequence of the injury, and the other of which was maybe cheating, depending on, well, definitely cheating on how you want to look at it. The first, and both occurred on the 20th of July, the very next game that the Giants played against the Reds. That was when Bobby Thompson took over at third base. Thompson had become somewhat of a player without a position because he was struggling at the plate at the time. The Giants had Muller and Lockman in the outfield, and a young phenom named Willie Mays, who, regardless of what struggles he might have had in the beginning of his career with the Giants, Leo DeRocher was determined that he was going to remain the Giants center fielder. Once Bobby Thompson had been the Giants center fielder until Willie Mays showed up. And once Hank Thompson was injured, Leo DeRocher moved Thompson over to third base. On the same day, July 20th, that's the day that Leo DeRocher sent Coach Herman Franks into the center field clubhouse at the Polo Grounds with a spyglass to read opposing catcher signs. And we all know the story about that. Thereafter, the Giants just became virtually unbeatable, especially at home. Whether that helped or not, I mean, that's for other people to decide, what kind of an impact that would have actually had. Anyway, Bobby Thompson, of course, as we know, really took off. He had a tremendous playing third base. He hit 357 with 16 homers, 52 RBIs after moving to third base, compared to only a 237 batting average, although his RBI and power output with 16 homers and 49 RBIs before that was still pretty good. Monty Irvin, a case could be made that he was perhaps actually the most valuable player in the National League, for real, in 1951. He finished the year with 24 homers, 121 runs batted in to lead the league, batted .312, and finished third in the MVP voting behind Roy Campanella and Stan Musial. Which brings us then to the 1951 World Series, where the New York Giants became the first team in Major League Baseball to field an all-black outfield. Monty Irvin in left in the World Series, Willie Mays in center, Hank Thompson in right field, making his first start at any position since the horrid injury that sidelined him in late July. Irvin went 11 for 24 in the World Series. Mays was 4 for 22. Thompson was 2 for 14. He did not start Game 5 probably because Eddie Lopat was pitching for a left-hander was pitching for the New York Yankees. And defensively, he had only 9 chances in the outfield, position that he hardly ever played. He made 2 errors. One of them was a throwing error in the opening game that contributed to a Yankee run. The Yankees would have went on to win the opening game. And the second was allowing a single by Yogi Berra to get by him in the 7th or 8th inning. I don't remember which, in Game 6. It was a tie game at the time, and the Yankees had a 3-run rally, wound up winning the game and the World Series by a score of 4-1. And that was actually in the 6th inning that he misplayed Berra's ground ball. Thompson started the 1952 season in a left field platoon with Bob Elliott, of all people. And then when Willie Mays was called up into the service in May, he replaced Mays in center field. And but beginning in August, Leo moved him back to third and Bobby Thompson back to center field. Ultimately, we wind up in 1954, where Willie Mays is back from the war. Thompson is the third baseman. Irvin is playing regularly and in the outfield. They have now also added Hank Thompson is back at third. They've added Ruben Gomez, a black pitcher from Puerto Rico, to their pitching staff, and the Giants win the pennant. And the 1954 World Series was the first World Series ever played in which both teams had black players in pivotal roles. For the Giants, again, it was Mays and Irvin, Thompson and Gomez. For the Indians, Larry Doby and Al Smith were starting players. And then, of course, you also had Dave Pope, an outfielder in reserve, whose most famous photograph is probably of him making a vain effort to catch Dusty Rhodes' home run down the right field line that won the opening game of the World Series, shortly after Willie Mays made his epic catch. So according to the similarity scores that were developed by Bill James to compare one player to another among contemporaries, the contemporary player whose career was most similar to Thompson's was Chicago Cubs third baseman Randy Jackson, who's not much remembered, if he's even remembered at all today. And in fact, that's kind of what the point of Hank Thompson really is that he was not exceptional. He was, in fact, quite good. And in fact, better than, I think, much better than just your average ordinary player. But it was not a certainty that under any circumstances other than the Giants being willing to give him the opportunity and stick with him, even after he had that injury in 1951, he was really the first player of modest but indisputably capable major league ability, black player to become a regular major league. And following him, you would then have players like Bill Bruton, Jim Gilliam, and others coming along. But that's the importance of Hank Thompson. And of the 9 players who were core regulars for at least 5 years between Jackie Robinson's debut in 1947 and 1960, 5 years after Jackie retired. Of the 9 players who were core regulars but not elite, remember 11 elite, 9 who were not, Hank Thompson was probably the best of them. Jim Gilliam, Hank Thompson averaged 3.8 wins above replacement for his 5 best years from 1950 to 1954. And in 1950 and 1954, at least according to the baseball reference version of WAR, he was the 10th best player both years in the National League. Then comes Jim Gilliam with 3.5 WAR for his best 5 years from 53 to 57. And then finally, Roberto Clemente. Now, he, of course, is one of those players on a career arc to become a Hall of Famer. But the first 5 years of his career, from 1956 to 1960, he was more of a typical average major league player, certainly extraordinarily capable. And later on, he would become a superstar. But that's the importance of Hank Thompson. And I think one of the things that are that's so important to remember about the New York Giants and the role that they played in integrating Major League Baseball. And on that point, I'd like to make the observation that really until arguably Joe Black and certainly Jim Gilliam, and Gilliam himself was a pretty damn good player, the Dodgers, when they were bringing in integrating Major League Baseball, went with can't lose, indisputably outstanding players, namely Jackie Robinson, Roy Campanella, and Don Newcombe. So that's basically, that was kind of like the key focus of the book that was, that was introduced at the start of this presentation.
Bryan, that was fabulous. It really was. Give it up for Bryan. We can open up the floor for you. I have a few questions. First of all, the book again, Golden Era Major League Baseball, Time of Transition and Integration. Bryan, where is this available?
It's available on the publisher's website, which is Rowman and Littlefield.
Okay.
Also on Amazon, because you can get anything you want on Amazon, I guess.
Let me tell you, first of all, I want to thank you, Bryan, for the book is not a New York Giant book. It's a book about Major League Baseball. And Bryan, you did a great job focusing on the New York Giants, which this group's about. So hats off to you for that. The first thing I noticed when I was researching, trying to find people was, of course, the cover of the book and the Giants, naturally. Now, you mentioned these famed players, 9 of them who, became Hall of Famers. Was there any discussion about putting them on the cover, or why did they choose this cover?
I'm the one who actually chose that cover. And
Okay.
the reason is that my original proposal was actually to just deal with kind of the Hank Thompson, Jim Gilliam, Bill Bruton players, and how it was important to recognize really that until you had players of major league ability who weren't elite players, weren't
Right.
superstars, being able to win major league jobs, you really can't say that integration had been consolidated. I think I say towards the end of the book that, in fact, in my opinion, it really wasn't until the mid to late 1960s that you could consider integration kind of a done deed in Major League Baseball, not only in the sense that every team by then had integrated, but also that you had a lot of players who were not elite, who were black players who were not elite, who were able to win starting positions. But to me, that was the major focus I wanted in the book. I had to expand it to include other things because otherwise there wouldn't have been enough pages, if you want to call it that, for the book itself. But that's why, to me, it was very important to have that particular cover. And the other reason was Leo DeRocher, not only because he was their manager, but also because of the role he played in terms of integrating the Dodgers with Jackie Robinson.
Well, I'm sure we all appreciate that cover. My
And
second question, uh, was there a quota that was official or unofficial about the number of African Americans that were allowed to be on a team?
there was an understanding, I guess would be the best way to put it, that at least until the mid 1950s, that thou shalt not have more than 3 players in the starting lineup at any time who are black. And in fact, one of the things I did, I wish I actually had that information at my fingertips now, but in subsequent years, I was kind of looking at when every team integrated and specifically when they had a black player in their opening day starting lineup. And it was a long, very slow process for Major League Baseball. And the Dodgers were the first team, obviously, once they had Newcomb join on days he pitched, to have 3 players in the starting lineup. They became later on the first team to have 3 black players in the starting lineup who were all position players, and also the first to have 4. And I think the Braves, for some reason, may have been the first to put 5 in the starting lineup.
Maybe there's a future book in there for you somewhere, okay? And anyway, let's go to Mars. Mars, you're up.
Thank you, Brian. That was very informative. I have statements and questions. The first one, I work as a music journalist in the jazz field. So I know that there are a lot of Black musicians that came up from the Deep South and lived in Philadelphia. The biggest names probably was Dizzy Gillespie, the 3 Heath brothers, McCoy Tyner, and there's many, many more. Eventually, they wound up in New York City because there were more clubs and more venues and all that. But there were so many Blacks in Philly, it behooves me, it befuddles me how there could be that the Philadelphia Phillies ball club stands out as being the most racist. So that's one thing. And the other statement I have, in 1951, I think the Giants won as many road games, or maybe even more road games, from mid-August on. So as far as that spy camera goes, that could be discounted just because of that, right?
Well, that's a very good point, and that I have an entire chapter on that in the book. I think it was called Leo DeRocher, the Spy Master, and I made that point. And in fact, it was in September. Almost all of their games in September were played on the road. They could not have won the pennant if they hadn't played just about as fabulously on the road as they did at home. Ultimately, my conclusion was it came down to this. If having Leo Herman Franks in looking through the spyglass in Centerfield Clubhouse, signaling signs, if that made a difference in just one game between the time they started that and the end of the season when they finished in the flat-footed tie with the Dodgers, if it made a difference in just one game, then it had an impact. But I don't know. I'm not personally prepared to say that it made that much of a significant difference at all. One thing that's interesting about that is that Monty Irvin, at least, was one of the players to insist he never wanted to rely on a center field spy. He didn't want to know what was coming. He wanted to basically, watch the pitcher himself and judge for himself what the pitch was going to be. Willie Mays, interestingly enough, basically he didn't say anything really one way or another. He actually seemed to be just waffling on it without coming down. But you're exactly right. And that's a point that actually I gave a presentation after the book appeared to the International Spy Museum, of all people. And that's a key point that I made, that, more games were played after, they were behind by 11 and a half games on August 13th. More games were played by the Giants on the road than were at home. They would not have won if they hadn't been absolutely fabulous on the road, which they were. And almost every game they played in September, unlike now where no team is away from home for longer than a couple of weeks at the most. They played almost the entire month of September on the road, and they won.
So here's a question I have for you. I know that the Giants had Ray Noble, Hank Thompson, Monty Irvin, Willie Mays. To keep a fifth player, he was a shortstop with the Oakland Oaks. His name escapes me right now. From what I understand about what happened then, where they didn't keep him, was because they would have to get a sixth player to be a roommate. So there were, so with six, you have three pairs of roommates. Therefore, the decision by Horace Stoneham was to send the shortstop down. I forget his names.
That wasn't Ray Dandridge, was it?
No.
Pardon?
No. We're talking about some other shortstop.
It was Artie Wilson.
Artie Wilson, right.
Artie Wilson, okay.
Exactly. Now, my question is, so if the Giants had four black players in 1951, how many did the Dodgers have?
I think they might have only had three still in 1951.
So
they're a rookie in 1952, right?
And now the last comment I have is about Hank Thompson. Well, he definitely had defensive liabilities at third and the outfield, which he hardly ever played. And so there, if he was batting 236, he showed some power. He might have had an impact in some games, but he was always a defensive liability. Do you agree with that?
That's my understanding as well. And that certainly that's one reason why I was very surprised, not obviously at the time, I wasn't even around at the time, but why I was surprised that the Giants would actually in the World Series start an all-black outfield, including Thompson, who hadn't played in the outfield since sometime in 1946 or something like that, when he was in the Negro Leagues. And in fact, he made two errors in 9 chances. I don't know why they did that, but and it obviously didn't win them the World Series. They probably weren't going to win the World Series anyway, but don't know.
Well, they might have had because it was a 6-game series, wasn't it?
6 games, yes.
Yeah. They might have had a better chance, I mean, we saw the Yankees blow the World Series with, of all people, Aaron Judge dropping the ball. It's like the Fred Snodgrass episode.
Yeah, I know. That's exactly what it reminded me of, was Fred Snodgrass.
Thanks, Mars.
Thank
Bill
you,
Flake, you're up.
Me?
Bill
Thank
Flake.
you very much, Brian, for, I think, we rarely get truly what I think are unique perspectives, eye-opening things. Like I'd never thought about the differential between the superstars and the guys that were just fighting for a position. It's a very interesting idea. Now, let me posit a hypothesis to you and run this by you. When we look at the managers who were part of the allowing more of the top players in, I'm talking about DeRocher, about Dressen, Fred Haney with the with Milwaukee. Compare and contrast them to these, okay? Alex Grammas, Solly Hemus, and Bobby Bragan. Now, when you talk about those three, what are we talking about? These are guys who are not real favorable towards black players. And I'm wondering if you think that some of this wasn't from the very top management down, but that it was the field level, and they were saying, I don't want to, I want to minimize, or I don't want a lot of these guys, because ultimately the guy was a racist. When you look at the teams that brought in the lesser quality blacks, I'm talking look who integrated the Reds, the Pirates, the Washington Nationals, as they were known then. The guys that came in were not going to start. They weren't going to. They were just tokens. I excuse the term, but that's what they were. They were tokens. And I think some of that could be I believe it's a reflection of management. I just wanted your thoughts on that.
I have actually 2 thoughts on that. One goes back to a point that I believe Mars was making earlier about Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, yeah.
Ben Chapman was manager of the Phillies in 1947 during Jackie Robinson's debut, and he was just a totally rabid racist. Those other guys you mentioned, that was the same thing. Charlie Grimm, for example, who managed the Braves at the beginning of their integration time, was, I'm not sure you would call him a racist, but he always liked to present himself as one of the boys. And so he alienated a lot of the black players, made it more difficult for them to integrate onto the team. He would make fun of them along with the rest of the white guys in the Braves clubhouse. Haney was better in terms of how he dealt with that. He also had the story with regard to Bertie Tebbetts and Brooks Lawrence, which I think is unfair actually to Tebbetts. But the word went out, including in Hank Aaron's biography, that the reason Brooks Lawrence did not win 20 games in 1956 was because he had 19 in early September, was because Bertie Tebbetts did not want a black pitcher to win 20 games, even though obviously Newcomb had already done so. Even in 1956, by September, he had already done so. That was the year Nuke won 26 games. I think that was probably misplaced because, in fact, if anything, Bertie Tebbetts was overusing Brooks Lawrence early in September in relief, in addition to starts that he was making, and just basically totally wore the poor guy out. Now, the second thought I had on that is that, unfortunately, I think it was also the owners, not just the managers. And that brings me to a point which might be somewhat controversial, but I'd like to raise it with regard to Major League Baseball now announcing that the Negro Leagues are a major league, which in principle, I absolutely agree with that. I don't want to begrudge them that at all. The concern that I have about doing that, saying that, is that it runs the risk in the longer term of kind of getting to sort of like a post-racial Major League Baseball where people forget how much of a challenge and how difficult it was for black pioneers, including totally elite players, let alone people like Hank Thompson or Jim Gilliam or Bill Bruton, to break into the majors. It's like, I think at one point I had mentioned Monty Irvin's major league debut, on the 8th of July of 1949. Well, that's when he broke into the white major leagues, what's traditionally been called Major League Baseball. But as a result of what, the Negro Leagues now being considered the major leagues, which again, I think it's appropriate that that be the case, you run the risk of saying, well, that really wasn't his major league debut. But on the other hand, you have to basically say he came into a totally new situation. It's a fundamentally new situation, a major challenge for him. It's not like I've been playing Major League Baseball for the last, in the case of Monty Irvin, for the last 10 years, and this is nothing new. It was fundamentally new and a fundamental challenge. That's my major concern, that you're winding up into sort of, as more time goes by, people will forget and not have an appreciation for just how difficult it was for black players breaking in. And the fact that it took, I would say, almost 2 full decades after Jackie Robinson broke in before you would have players not with average major league ability, who could clearly play, black players with average major league ability who could clearly compete for positions, really being able to count on being able to so compete. 2 decades before that became kind of the norm in Major League Baseball. May the best person earn the job.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you very much.
Frank Sexton, you're up.
Yes, Brian, fantastic presentation, very interesting. And my congratulations on your research abilities, your obvious
Yeah.
research abilities. By the way, you opened the presentation with a quote from a newspaper article written July 6, 1949, my birth date. A question. How were the Giant fans to the initial black players? How was management? How were the fans? How were the New York sports writers? Had everybody kind of gotten this sort of out of their system because of Robinson, or was it still, how friendly was the atmosphere? And how was the reaction to these players when they traveled?
Uh, I can't really answer that definitively, um, because I haven't really looked into the sort of like the media aspect of that at the time. But my impression was, don't one of the things that Branch Rickey was able to take advantage of in terms of Jackie Robinson was that New York State, I think it was during the war, passed legislation that essentially demanded that any business operating in the state, including Major League Baseball, could not discriminate against blacks. So I think, you're talking about a state where this was a little bit more the idea of blacks being members of society, even if you want to say they're not exactly equal members of society. Among many whites might have felt that way even in the North. But I think that New York was more accommodating to that sort of thing, except for maybe Yankee fans. But
Well,
that's just a dig.
don't forget David Haberstrom's great book. I'm sure all of you have read it, October 1964, where he talks about the World Series between the St. Louis Cardinals and the New York Yankees. And a major theme of that book is how the American League had really fallen behind in getting a lot of the black talent that had been available up to that point. And that was really exhibited in that World Series.
Yes, and in fact, that's also addressed in other chapters in the book about how slow the American League was. I mean, they had very few by 1960. Very few black players had won major league jobs for as many as 5 seasons. In fact, I would say the answer would be Vic Power, Hector Lopez, Al Smith, and then two elite players, which would be Larry Doby and Minnie Minoso. That's it. The only players who by 1960, among only black players who by 1960 had played at least 5 years as a regular on an American League ball club.
And the last American League team to integrate was?
Our beloved friends in Boston, Pumpsie Green, and then shortly thereafter, Earl Wilson.
Thank you, Frank. Howard, you're up.
Yeah, hi, Brian. Great presentation. You spoke a lot about the Giants, of course, and the Dodgers. The last question kind of stole a little bit of my thunder. I was going to ask you about that other New York team, the Yankees, maybe because I'm a Bronx boy who despised them. But just because you kind of made the point already about the American League and whatever, is it true that the Ed Weiss, or George Weiss, excuse me, was the force behind the Yankees not integrating as quickly as they did? I think Elston Howard was the first one, and he was platooning, I suppose, with Yogi Berra.
Yes. Elston Howard, yes.
There were very few. That was, I think, the late 50s, 59 or something. And then later with the Mets, I heard some stories that he wasn't thrilled. I mean, the Met black players were not, Al Jackson, the pitcher, who actually had potential. But I heard that George Weiss, who was living up in rich Greenwich, Connecticut, just did not appreciate black ball players. And many of the Mets, and I guess this was the case with other teams also, that had spring training in the South, saw that their teammates could not eat with them or stay in the same hotels with them. The Mets started out, I think, in St. Petersburg, before they eventually, years later, moved up to Port St. Lucie. And the Yankees went down to Lauderdale, which is semi-New York down there. Can you blame Weiss on this? I mean, there was also Topping and Del Webb, who, white business people. who owned hotels and real estate. What's the story with the Yankees as far as you know?
I'm glad that you mentioned Topping and Webb because I personally believe it was them in addition to Weiss. And this thing, I think they caught, I'm not willing necessarily to say that they were racially, had racial animosities, but I do think they bought into this whole Yankees mythology, that we've always been this particular way and we always had to be this particular way. One thing that's been of interest to me, well, which probably many of you all know, Vic Power. He was in the Yankees farm system back when Kansas City was actually a minor league farm club of the AAA minor league farm club of the Yankees. Terrific ball player. And the Yankees always had after Lou Gehrig until maybe Joe Pepitone. Anyway, they went through this very fallow period of not really having a really good first baseman. Vic Power would have fit that bill tremendously. But one of the problems Vic Power had, in addition to being black, and that was a problem for the Yankees, was he was a flamboyant black. Black players, and this was one of the complaints that surfaced in the MacPhail report that was done at the time of integration, 1946-47, kind of in response to Branch Rickey's efforts or intention to integrate the Dodgers. One of the things he was basically concluding, the MacPhail report concluded is, they don't play serious baseball. You have too much hot dogging and stuff like that. But these are, very, very good ball players. They regarded Minnie Minoso's activities on the base paths and Jackie Robinson's activities on the base paths, and certainly Vic Power, the way he fielded, as being just unnecessary flamboyance. Why can't you just be more, solid, stable on the ground and play like a white guy type of thing? That was a real serious
It's ironic
problem.
that you mentioned that because, of course, the Yankees eventually got Joe Pepitone, who you mentioned, and he was as flamboyant as you can get. They made a big deal about his hairstyle. He had the hot comb, and really went overboard on that. And black play, they probably would, oh, what do you got that big? I remember Oscar Gamble in the 70s had that big, tremendous afro. And
Yeah.
are you familiar with that? You must be familiar with that. And there was some grumbling about that. I mean, the baseball cap was miniature compared to his hairstyle. So it was ironic, though, that Pepitone came right, after you talked about Vic Power. Because he was a ladies' man. He, whatever he was. So the Yankees had a history of the white guys being, and of course Mickey and the whole thing at the Copacabana and the fighting and whatever. So the Yankees were not exactly choir boys, but they were all whites. And if they were black, if there was a black guy at the Copacabana, he probably would have ended up in jail that night.
Right. Just two other quick points on that. Elston Howard. One of the reasons the Yankees finally got to the point in 1955 where, with the Dodgers integrated, with the Dodgers and the Giants integrated, with both of the, with the success those teams were having, winning pennants and also even World Series. Although the Dodgers hadn't won yet in 1955 when the Yankees brought up Elston Howard. But they were kind of backed into a corner to have to accept the black. One reason they chose Elston Howard, even though Casey Stengel argued that he got the one black who can't run. But anyway, one reason they chose him was because they figured he fit the Yankee mold of reserved dignity.
Yeah.
That he wasn't going to hot dog it. One other thing I wanted to come back to quickly on the MacPhail report, since I mentioned it, another argument they made, and this is one of the concerns I have about considering the Negro Leagues major leagues, was the MacPhail report said the blacks have their major leagues. It's the Negro Leagues. They don't need to join. We don't need any integration. They've got their league. We got our league. And that's, of course, one of the things that I'm concerned about in terms of potential fallout down the line of this decision, which again, I believe is the right thing to do. It should be regarded as those guys were major leaguers, but you have to still make a distinction between the traditional major leagues as we understand it, and even they understand it, and not.
Thank you,
Well, a
Howard.
quick question. very quick.
Am I in line?
42, which had Ben Chapman featured prominently as the manager of the Phillies, really taunting Jackie. Was that an accurate portrayal of Ben Chapman in the movie 42? I'm sure you've seen that movie.
I did see the film. I've read about that incident too, and he was horrible about it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it was very accurate.
Yeah.
Before my time, so I was just wondering. Thank you.
And,
Frank
and
Lewis,
as
you're-
was Eddie Stanky's defense of his teammate.
Yeah.
Frank Lewis.
Before we get into the serious stuff, I have a number of topics. Who was Bill Bruton's father-in-law?
Bill Bruton?
Yeah.
I don't know.
William Judy Johnson, Hall of Fame player out of the Negro League.
Okay.
Now, among other things, you haven't discussed integration of professional basketball and football was integrated before baseball started. Is there any study of the the comparison of that, and also what Adam pointed out that it took was it 20 years before there was the first black umpire? 20 years after Jackie Robinson.
He asked about the first black umpire, and then he said, "Is there anything in the book about baseball starting after football and basketball integrated?"
No, there isn't. And I didn't, unfortunately, address the issue of umpires.
Before baseball started integrating, is that correct?
Frank, you're a little hard to hear. It's very foggy.
Okay, all right. Can you hear me now?
A little better.
All right, I'll get even closer to the microphone and this one. It was not quite 20 years before, I think it was Emmett Ashford, the first black umpire. And also in 47, professional basketball and football were integrated. And it was on, comment, please.
Basketball.
Do you have any comments about Emmett Ashford and again about baseball following basketball and football as integrated sports?
Unfortunately not. Emmett Ashford, I understand one of the complaints that they had about him as an umpire when he first broke in was he was a little bit too flamboyant, if you will, in some of his out calls.
Thank you, Frank. Ed Freer, you're up.
It's not
Yep,
just him,
thank-
it's other, why weren't there more black umpires earlier?
Brian, do you know why there weren't any black umpires earlier?
I'm assuming it was the same reason there weren't black managers earlier than there were, which was just sort of this stereotypical impression that they wouldn't be up to the job. And also that perhaps they would have a difficult time exercising authority in a league that was still predominantly not black, predominantly white.
Thank you, and thanks for a great presentation.
Okay, we got Ed and then Jim Folkerts. You'll take us home. Ed Freer, you're up.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I want to thank you, Brian, for a very animated discussion. Two things. First is I remember Hank Thompson, and when he was playing, I always thought of him as a bit of a power hitter. I kind of felt good that, he might hit a home run when I saw him play. And number two, if you could comment on, I think the reason he was playing right field in the World Series, Don Mueller slid into third base and was injured.
Actually, that's correct. I should have actually thought of that. And Mueller's injury was right before Bobby Thompson hit his home run.
I guess you and I are going to disagree whether it's Mueller or Mueller, but
okay.
But he did hit a home run, did he? Thompson did
in the series.
Yeah,
I don't think so.
No, I didn't. But he gave us the thrill that he had a chance every time he got up. Okay, that's the only comment I wanted to make. Put two and two together.
Thank
okay,
you, Ed.
but you're correct. You're correct on that. About
Jim
Mueller.
Folkerts, take us home.
Okay, hey Brian, I look forward to reading your book. I did want to ask one question about the player managers transition. Were there that many at that time, left? And what was your? Could you give just a brief, overview of what you cover in the book?
I did address the issue of player managers, and Marty Marion, maybe also Fred Hutchison, may have been about two of the last at that time. As you know, player managers were very popular in the 1930s during the Depression. And frankly, it had been relatively popular in Major League Baseball all the way up until World War II.
I think Joe Torre was a play manager for the Mets when he first joined the Mets.
Yeah, very briefly.
Very briefly.
Yeah, and it was actually Marion and Hutchison would both be kind of, and maybe Eddie Jost, however you pronounce his name,
Yost.
possibly him too. They were all at the ends of their careers, as was Joe Torre. Whereas Lou Boudreau, I think, was the last of the of the old time player managers who were active ball players. Not necessarily all of them great. Like Bucky Harris wasn't a great ball player. He was very good though. But in addition to being a manager, Lou Boudreau, I think, was about the last. Well, in fact, was the last true player manager.
Thank you, Jim. Let's all give it up for Bryan Soderholm-Difatte. Bryan, great way to start the new year. It was a great presentation. And again, interested in the book, here is the cover. Golden Era of Major League Baseball, A Time of Transition and Integration. Available at the publisher site and, as Bryan mentioned, on Amazon. Again, a great way to start the new year. We will reconvene next Thursday with Jerry Eisenberg. Until then, great weekend. Thank you all for hopping aboard tonight. And Bryan,
wonderful presentation.
I'm sorry?
Thank you.
Wonderful presentation.
Right, it was a great presentation, really was. I'll hang around if anybody wants to talk Giant baseball, but until next week, have a great week.